So thank you guys. Today's session is going to be on fundraising agreement types and at the very end, valuation. So let's just jump right into it. So goal of this session, right? First, know the most commonly accepted formats of fundraising in Japan and what laws that they are subject to, along with some of the requirements and implications that these might have. And in other words, advantages, disadvantages, and then finally just being able to align it with essentially what your business goal is going to be. Are you looking for just move fast, get a lot of investments, or are you looking for more longer term, more mediated, controlled? So the three types covered today will be JKISS, convertible note, and crowdfunding in order. So we can start with the JKISS. Just a really brief history. The JKISS actually is adopted from the KISS, which stands for Keep It Simple Security, and it originated in Silicon Valley, and is very, very similar to the SAFE developed by the Y Combinator. With the recent change now, it's even more similar, and we'll get to that. But essentially, this was just brought to Japan very recently. You can see 2016. It's been actually about 6 years now, and it's designed to just be able to raise capital quickly and simply. Get the money first, work with it, figure out all of the conversions and the shares and the valuation later stage. And right now, from what we know, it's hard to say exactly how many seed round investments have been using the JKISS, but what it's estimated to be about 20%, because what JKISS has been able, what Coral Capital, the company that brought it, has been able to report is that there's about 1,000 packages downloaded per year. The key features, we're talking about convertible equity here for JKISS, which means that it's actually quite nice. It's an option. You first receive money, you promise them that later on they'll get some equity, they'll get shares, and then it converts at a later date. Fairly low complexity because there's a standardized template, and there's no strict maturity or deadline. There still is probably a maturity or deadline because, again, all investors want to be able to know that they have a return on their investments. And so there is one, but it's not so capped as some other options. Valuation cap and discount is also available, which we'll talk about in a bit. And one of the key benefits of convertible equity is that it's actually tracked as equity on your financial statement, which means that it doesn't hurt you in any way. It's not a liability. So as of this year, maybe less than 2 months ago, actually, now that I think about it, maybe just 1 month ago, it's been updated. And so right now the English template is not yet available. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll be updated and be available soon, so only Japanese. But the key point is that the valuation cap calculation and the agreement has been changed from pre-money to post-money. It doesn't automatically override the old versions, meaning that if you still want to use it, technically you can. It just depends on the investors you talk to. And on top of that, if you've already thought about executing older versions and they have already been in place, they'll still remain. The agreement terms don't change just because it's been updated. So technically, you can still do pre-money, but I think now you have two different options, and we'll talk about a little bit about what the differences are and what post-money is. The end scenarios can be three different cases, right? One is the JKISS is actually locked into the Seed A, Series A, Seed A, kind of like that interesting like gray area between when you convert from early stage seed into Series A, and the hard number that they put is 100 million JPY in equity, which means that as soon as you're able to raise that, all the conditions set in the JKISS will convert. The second thing that could happen potentially is a company buyout happens before you actually reach that maturity, and so this is actually put in to protect the investor to say that if this happens, at least they're not only going to get their money back, they're going to get it back at 2x. So it's a little bit of a hedging for them. And then the third case, where after 18 months, which is considered a soft deadline, if you still have not matured and raised the amount of funds you need to convert, the investor has a few options and you can negotiate with them. They can even convert to common stock at a agreed upon price, which will require a valuation at that time. Or you can kind of reset and say, let's change some of the conditions that we currently have, and I'm going to push for this to meet this time. So it's a little bit flexible, and it really depends on what the investor is willing to do, but this is one of the benefits of JKISS, where you do have the renegotiation option. So this is now, I've put screenshots of the standardized template, and again, the revised English version is to come hopefully, but at least you can see it's very, very straightforward. Everything has been vetted by legally. All the words are, the language is set. All you have to do essentially is just edit all of the yellow sections to put your own details in and your own numbers in. So the second type now, convertible note. What is this and how is it different? So convertible note is a different type of financing. It's considered debt, which means that one, there's interest involved, and two, it is slightly more complex because there's not necessarily a standard that everyone uses. There are templates floating out there, but still it's case by case and things can change. One of the key features, again, is with interest, you do have to pay the principal plus the interest, but if it does not mature, now you actually have a hard requirement to return that cash in full plus the interest. And so you can see the convertible note now is a little bit more friendly for the investor. Potentially, friendly is a little bit subjective, but in essence, it protects the investor a little more. The maturity is usually 18 months, subject to change. You can change it if the investor actually agrees to it. Similarly, valuation cap and discounts also still available. And one thing though to note is that unlike the convertible equity, convertible note, because it is debt financing, it's actually tracked as a liability. And this could potentially not look so good to certain financial institutions, especially if you may be looking for a subsidy or a loan if you are qualify for those. And on top of that, a liability means that if you run out of cash at the end and you cannot repay it, you could be insolvent, which leads to other issues as well. So it's a little bit more risk. The end scenarios, this one is not as much because there's no third renegotiation term usually, but one is you fulfill the maturity period and you give the equity granted in the amount of the principal plus interest. And then this other is if you just don't fulfill it, then essentially the agreement expires and you're required to return that money back to the investor. And again, templates do exist, right? For example, I actually even found one on PandaDoc, but this is in English, which is written for American law. So even getting it to fit Japanese law, you would either have to get your own lawyer to be able to check it and review it, or find a fully Japanese template. But there are templates floating out there potentially too that you can use. It's just not as standardized. And then, so just a quick review, comparison between the two because they're very similar. They're both convertible. Just one is equity and one is debt. And so you can see the complexity for both is actually still quite low, but convertible note is just slightly higher because it's not standardized. The note has interest, which means that you do have to pay a little bit extra back. And on top of that, if this expires, you have to return that cash. There usually is a hard deadline. Convertible equity is up for renegotiation, so considered a soft deadline. They both have valuation caps and discounts, which we'll look at in a bit. And one is tracked as an equity option, which does not affect your overall balance sheet at all, but the other one is a liability, which does. So the third type now is crowdfunding, right? Let's look a little bit more at crowdfunding details. This is very interesting in Japan, maybe not even just Japan, all over the world. So essentially, we can think of crowdfunding as two different categories. You have the donation/reward model, and then you have the equity model. The difference between these two generally is as listed here, but just to sum it up, the donation reward model is essentially you're gaining cash to be used in the form of let me rephrase that. You're gaining cash to be able to be used for expenses, and all you really have to give back is either nothing or maybe offer some rewards. Like you've seen the crowdfunding, donate this much, you get a free t-shirt with our logo on it. You get this higher tier, you get some extra perks, etc. Equity model is a little bit different where you're actually not just getting the money, you're returning a portion of equity back to that investor. So it's more like a controlled, smaller version of equity financing. And so these are some of the common platforms and target people that you're going for. In Japan specifically, we have, I think on the left side, so this is kind of ordered based on from left to right. You have Kickstarter and Campfire, which are very, very more geared towards just general fundraising, and then on the right side you also have maybe Ready For and Fundino, which lean a little bit more for equity. But in general, a lot of these, because they're very Japanese, it does require some Japanese knowledge to be able to navigate. And on top of that, you do have to apply to get into these accounts, because you have to get an account with them, because you have to submit your company information. And some of these are not as receptive to international run companies for some reason or another. But these are options that that we know of. There are also a couple that are not listed, but those are actually not even worse and not even really considered, so I didn't actually include them here. But it's just an idea. And then you can see, usually for donation reward type, you're thinking about getting it directly from people such as family and friends, and maybe the general public. The equity model, you're potentially looking more for organized, such as angels and companies. And so who is it actually good for, right? I think this depends essentially on what your product is and what you're going for. Because if your product is actually more B2C as opposed to B2B, and you feel like there's a bigger crowd to be reached, and on top of that you would like some publicity, going for a donation reward model is actually really great. It gets that public buy-in. You can gain traction. At the same time, you could also even test the market, see what the actual interest is. The equity model is more for if you're looking for early investors or mentors who to have like a potential stake, a small percentage, so that they essentially can provide you guidance and direction. The only downfall is, again, this is quite controlled, and a convertible note or convertible equity is probably much better if you're going strictly for angel investors. And so here is a table summarizing kind of the advantages and disadvantages. And on the right here in the gray is just a standard equity common stock comparison, right? Just for reference. So as you can see, advantages to the founder, JKISS has quite a bit. Right? We talked about some of these already. No maturity means there's less pressure. There's no interest. Very fast, low complexity. You don't have to deal with the valuation, and the amount you receive actually is not taxed. Right? And that makes sense because you're just essentially receiving it ahead of time. And then for investors, this is actually pretty nice for them too, because it's flexible and it's low complexity. The point is to get the money and go. Right? Don't waste your time on trying to figure out the valuation when you could be actually still building your company early on. The disadvantage right here, so this is a caveat. The reason I have this in terms of maybe harder is because if you remember, JKISS in Japan is still kind of new. Kind of, right? 2016, it's not so much in circulation yet. With the new updated change as well to post money, maybe there's a little bit more research and understanding to be done on the investor parts as well. So it's a little bit variable right now. And another disadvantage, especially to the investors, that no maturity means that they could be taking a big gamble. They might not even get anything at all. Convertible note and the debt is very, very similar, except that it just provides a stronger safety net for the investors, meaning that they can get that cash back and they can pull out if they don't want to be involved anymore. Right? And I think the only thing worth mentioning about common stock, I guess, on this side is you actually have more control. If you don't have one of these, which we'll talk about later on about why it postpones the valuation, the common stock, you can actually control how much you give away, which gives you as a founder much greater power. And on top of that, this could be good for the investor, because since they're just buying direct common stock, they could be eligible for tax relief immediately. Right? But then again, because it's controlled, the investor might not feel as involved, because you come to agreement and say, hey, I'm just going to get 5%, and that 5% is just never going to change. And on top of that, further future investments and fundraising dilute them, right? Whereas these that we'll see shortly actually protect them a bit more. And then here is just a comparison, similarly, advantages and disadvantages between reward donation crowdfunding and equity crowdfunding. And again, I think generally what I would say is the advantage, to sum this up, is that it's very good to gain traction and test the market. The disadvantage on this side is that because you're just kind of essentially accepting donations, you may be subject to large commission fees and gift taxes, which means you're not getting the full amount at all. And on top of that, even for the investor, they feel less involved, so you're actually not even building that much investor relationships as well. The fundraising could be a way to get early cash, but then it kind of stops there as well. And then on the equity side, again, similar to common stock, you are controlling how much you're giving away, which is great especially if you're not looking for so much maybe direct and heavy investor input and decision making. But the disadvantage is, especially with equity crowdfunding, you can't necessarily control who is purchasing it. Your cap table might be bloated, you have commission fees, and on top of that, investors may not really even, they might just be, putting in a little bit just to see what happens, and they're not really as invested. And so you probably are not getting as much mentorship or investor input and exposure as you might like as well. And so here are a summary of some of the more legal proceedings related to each. And so if we just focus on JKISS, right here, you can see JKISS is probably the most simple in that there's an open source template. You do have to register it, so this is a common thing across most of these. There's really no discussion around this. The legal complexity, again, very, very simple because it's standardized. Convertible note is just one slight step up because there are some input you need. And on top of that, especially working in Japan, you may need a Japanese lawyer. Equity crowdfunding, also, this is more of a case-by-case basis. And also, you may need to have agreements for share purchases or a stock option agreement and vesting schedule. This is something that accountants also have some experience in that they can help provide. But when you're working directly with common stock purchases, these agreements do need to be drawn up, and they tend to be a little bit unique as well. And so these will need some. I think in Japan, the vesting schedule I think is required to be 7 years minimum, something like that. There's rules involved, but so as you can already see, there's a little bit more to pay attention to. And again, similarly, the legal complexity means that you do need to just check and make sure that you are abiding by the general rules of Japan. And on the side of a reward donation crowdfunding, the only really thing to pay attention to is that while you still have to register, on top of that, all donations now potentially might be subject to gift tax. And this is a summary of all the fees and taxes that might be involved in your fundraising. In JKISS and convertible note, even when you issue and register it, you do have to pay 90,000 JPY. This is something you can't really avoid. It's just think of it as a registration fee. Equity crowdfunding, you will have to pay any platform commission fees to the platform, and it's as high as 20%. So that's actually quite a big cut. In the donation fundraising, it's the same. You have a platform commission fee up to 20%, and on top of that, you might be subject to gift tax as well. In terms of actually registering your capital increase once you've successfully fundraised, it's more of like a one-time processing fee. You just pay the higher of either 30,000 flat or 0.7% of whatever amount you're increasing by. And then later on, this is more actually relevant to the reward donation crowdfunding because these apply almost immediately. However, for all of them, even in the future, when you think about selling your stocks and exchanging ownership, capital gains is a flat 20%, and this applies to every single type of equity. And the inheritance tax, depending on what gift it is, or if you're getting it from a family member, it's tiered based on the amount received. And the tiering is actually quite similar to the gift tax tiering. And we're actually going to just take a look at this now, right? Just for reference. Inheritance tax, we can talk about first. This one's really simple. It's just based on how much you're actually receiving at one time and the tax rate associated with each. And one thing to note here is that this is not what I would say scaled per se. Like the first 10 is 10%, the next 20 between 10 to 30 is 15. It's if you fall between 10 to 30, the entire amount is 15%. Right? That's so as far as we know. And so it's a little bit strange why it's done that way, but it is something good to know because now you can potentially strategize, right? If you're going to be in this group anyway, getting 30% getting 30 million versus getting 10 million, right? That actually could make a big difference between just lowering that amount to like 1 and getting like, let's say 9.99, which means you're actually saving 5% potentially, right? So that is something interesting to consider. Gift tax, this is relating to amounts above 1.1. So apologies if this is a little bit confusing. So that's why this is 0, because if you're lower than 1.1, you don't get taxed at all. But if you go above it, if you're between 0 to 2 above, it's 10%. And similarly, it goes from 10 to 55. So key takeaways before we go into the actual calculations. In general, JKISS has higher benefits for founders, and convertible notes have higher benefits for investors. I think we've seen that. The investors, especially in Japan, where we know most of the people are tend to be risk adverse and conservative, you can see why having that safety net of cash is very, very nice. Right? Convertible notes is quite popular in Japan. JKISS is taking traction recently, and it's great, but so it's always an option for founders to pursue. Crowdfunding is also an option, but definitely there's stronger implications. Right? If you go the equity route, you can bloat your cap table. If you raise too much money, that's an interesting problem to have, right? If you raise a lot of money, let me rephrase it, you can get hit by pretty high taxes, and in the end, you actually don't get that much, right? So getting that high amount with a JKISS or convertible note is definitely more preferable. And then finally, just one note is that JKISS and convertible note is more for one-on-one conversations. You're looking for that very intense, more driven mentorship, one-on-one. Let's get this done. Talk bigger amounts. Whereas crowdfunding is kind of spreading your attention, getting as much traction as you can, and hopefully little amounts add up so that it can get you going as well. Both are valid, but just very different types of operation and implications. Great. So before we go into the actual valuation, questions from anyone? Clarification on any part?
I'm a little surprised that crowdfunding isn't in general more popular, especially because of the examples given that it tests the market,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I th-
Is Mhm.
I think it is popular with a lot of Japanese startups, right?
Ah,
Because if you actually look, all of these platforms, they're heavily Japanese, and if you actually go on there, there's tons and tons and tons of companies on there, right? I would say it is quite popular because, like you said, it's a very good way to test it. But I think it's maybe something. This is actually something that I'm not too sure of, but my guess is because it is a very good way to do it, a lot of founders do take that route, especially if they're Japanese. However, they may or may not be aware of how much money they're actually giving up due to commissions, etc., or due to like the tax involved.
and you said that doing crowdfunding somehow mm, like doesn't sit well with investors.
The equity model. The equity model
Ah,
because uh let me see, where is it? Uh because once you actually provide, because when you do equity crowdfunding, you can't necessarily control who's looking at it, right? The reason you did it, you're doing crowdfunding with equity is you're putting it
mm,
out there to see how much attention you get.
right.
You could very well get 100 people buying like 0.5% of your company. Your cap table is going to be so long that in the future, when you talk to other investments, maybe like later stage funding for VCs, they're going to look at you and be like, what is happening right now? All right. Like,
Ah, right. So this
right.
is what you mentioned the other day when you want to have the list of investors, of other investors as small as possible.
Yes. Yeah.
Ah, right.
Right. And
So, yeah.
especially as early when you're in the very beginning, getting your first investor, that's actually very, very important because the very first investor, depending on what agreements you give them, could actually cause a domino effect for the rest. If you give them such favorable terms, future VCs are going to look at you and be like, I don't see any like outcome for me because this first investor is going to get everything,
Ah, right.
right?
So this then outweighs the kind of proof of concept,
Yeah.
maybe, that
Yes.
a successful crowdfunding campaign would be.
Yeah,
All right.
exactly, right? So
Mhm.
that's also why I say this has to do with your goals because how far are you trying to go with your funding? Be- right? I think that's to
Right.
consider because it's very fine if you believe that one crowdfunding round is all you need and then you're set, right? You're set for the rest of your startup career. But if you know that you also want bigger VC and bigger money, the equity crowdfunding might not be the way to go.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
I can mention a cautionary tale about the equity crowdfunding too.
Hmm.
So my previous company did Fundino,
Okay.
and there's certain, okay, well, things didn't go well with that company, and they ended up going bankrupt, and they did a sale, a transfer of the business to another company. But there were like a lot of procedures that require all of the investors to sign off on. So if you have 100 people that like basically they needed to get approval from all of the Fundino investors to sell the business.
That's wild. Yeah.
So I don't know. There
Yeah.
could be other situations, like even maybe more favorable situations, but it just be where it would become a logistical problem.
Yes. Yes. That's a very good point. Right. One is even tracking down all of them and getting them to agree to sign off on it.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
that
So
was an issue. It
yeah.
delayed things quite a bit, actually.
Yep. Yep. So as you can see, the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the harder it gets, for sure. Even if all the cooks only have a small piece. Yeah. Because it's just, I think the legal implications aren't there, right? It's law, and that's what happens. I think that this is just a random sidetrack, right? This is one of the reasons why I think in Japan there's so many houses where the original owner has passed away, but literally the houses just sit there untouched. The government doesn't even claim it because they just cannot, right? So this is like kind of just an example, right? Regardless of how illogical it might be to get the sign off of 100 shareholders of who all have a stake in your company, it's required to do so, and therefore, in order to do it, you have to get it, right? And that's kind of how it works. Yep. Okay, great. So maybe we could just move into the valuation part next. All right, so let's talk about valuation and what pre-post money mean now, because things have changed. So this is just a quick overview. If you don't already know, pre-money just means that your valuation, when a company decides to give you funding, the pre-money valuation is how much your company is worth before you add the amount of that company gives you, right? And then post-money means that if your company is going to be valued at a post-money rate, after this investor gives you this money, including the money they just gave you, that's what your company is valued at. Let's look at numbers. Numbers are a little more clear, right? So let's just say that you start, you have a pre-money valuation of 1 million. Pre-money valuation of 1 million at the time that an investor gives you 250K means that before they gave you the 250K, you are already worth 1 million. And so therefore, after you receive that money, now you're totally worth 1.25. Post money means that if an investor gives you 250K at post money valuation of 1 million, it means including that 250, now you're worth 1 million. Right? And then so this actually changes the percent ownership potentially between the founder and the investor. And so this designation actually does matter, and it does carry over in some of the conversions, and we'll see that very shortly. So just a sample calculation. When we talk about post-money valuation, I think this is usually what you guys are more comfortable with when someone might say an investor wants to invest 10% of the company, right? Usually when they give you a hard number like that, they're usually referring to post-money because they're essentially protected, meaning regardless of how much money that you might get in the future, when they invest this money to you at this valuation, they're going to get 10%. It's worth 10% even when you add in the new shares, right? And then so essentially the calculation is just whatever investment amount they give you and the agreed upon equity you're going to give them, that is going to give you the post money valuation, right? They give you 3 mil, that 3 mil is worth 10%, therefore your company must be worth 30 mil, right? And then just to get the pre-money valuation from the post-money, all you have to do is just subtract the investment you just received, and it essentially implies that your company was a pre-money valuation of 27 million. Right. So again, like this is just sample calculations for our better understanding, and let's actually look at some of the cases now. So let's talk about JKISS. The big change is that the valuation cap wording has changed to post-money. What this does mean is that in terms of talking about giving up company ownership, there's a lot more clarity for founders. When an investor gives you money, you just say, I'm going to give you 10%, 10% calculation, done deal. Whereas in pre-money, because it's based on an actual calculation, it's really hard to say, even if an investor potentially wants 10%, they're not going to get it because they're going to get diluted by other seed investors, by other funding. The purpose of post-vote money is to protect you before you go into actual Series A funding, right? And then again, I'll show you the example, but I just want to make that part clear. And if this is not already known, for the JKISS, conversion is triggered by future equity financing, meaning that it is heavily reliant on what you can raise in the time period. If you can't raise it, it never matures, it never converts, and then you either have to return that money if it's a convertible note. But in the case of JKISS, you just need to figure out how the investor wants to proceed from there and come to a compromise. And so based on some of the rules that you set in the JKISS, there's up to 3 different conversion rates that can happen. And we'll look at all of them and how it's decided. Essentially, one of them is that's used as a reference that you always calculate is what is the price per share in that financing round. So in essence, how much price per share by the time you raise your Series A funding. And then on top of that, you're going to either apply a valuation cap to reduce it, or you're going to apply a conversion discount to reduce it. And whichever one is the lowest will actually be taken. So before we actually go into the calculations, just a quick journey, just to make sure we're ever on the same page. After you initially sign a JKISS with an investor, you receive the money at that time. The money comes ahead of time. You shake hands, done deal. Then you use that money to continue to build your business, and you proceed into other financing rounds. And then finally, once you actually finish your financing round and reach that agreed upon amount, at that point, usually anytime you receive a financing, there is always going to be a valuation that happens, right? The pre-money valuation that occurs, especially for Series A. Using that money, you can start to back calculate to the investor that gave you the JKISS and figure out how much price per share they should be getting. And then again, based on the 3 conversion rates we just talked about, the lowest one benefits the JKISS executor, the holder, the most. That's the amount that they will get. So let's take a look at an example, right? Examples speak the most. I'm going to throw a lot of information here, but we're going to try and refer back to it just to keep it in check. So let's say, just to start off, you've signed a JKISS and you received 250K. All right, so just keep that in mind. This angel investor gave you 250K to work with. By the definition, as a reminder, JKISS matures at 1 million. Right, so just keep that in mind. Let's say in Series A, the later financing round, you close at this 1 million. We're just going to try and keep it simple for now. So you met this requirement and you're good. In this equity financing round, when you raised this 1 million, your pre-money valuation was determined to be 5 million. And so now let's take a look at the cap table before, right? So this is before the equity financing round and before the JKISS. So you can see your angel investors doesn't show up yet because again, it has not converted yet. You're starting with 5 million shares only. And if your pre-money valuation is determined to be 5 million at the round close, that means your pre-money price per share is $1, right? That's easy. 5 million divided by 5 million, just $1. That now is our reference point. So keep that in mind. $1 is our reference price per share. So let's look at scenario 1, which is the regular scenario of how a JKISS actually works. So we're going to first assume there's no cap and no discount just to keep things simple. As we just said, these new investors locked in a price of $1 per share, and they essentially set the value. They set the baseline. By default, because in the JKISS, if you remember, we talked about the JKISS delays the valuation to this later stage. And so by default, because you set no other terms, this number just gets duplicated and carried over, and the angel investor benefits and says, hey, thanks for determining the price per share for me at this later stage. Now just give me my shares. Right? This is a very straightforward calculation. And so they just benefit from that. And as you can see, from this price and per share and the investment amount they put in, you now can calculate exactly how many shares they get. And you add these shares on top of your existing shares, and this is how you can see what has happened with the dilution. Right? So the founder and the stock option pool has dropped down to about 80% actually exactly. And you can see that the Series A investors get 16, and then the angel investors lock in at 4. All right, so this is the case of just understanding how a JKISS works. Now let's add the cap in. So this is where it gets interesting and maybe potentially tricky. So now let's say that we have put in a 2.5 million post-money value cap. Right, so the key here is the JKISS now is post-money. So well, let's not talk about this yet. All right, let's look down here. This might help. So if you remember, in the beginning, we had $1 per share. By talking about post money, if you remember, what you're saying is after the investor gives you this amount, they're going to maintain that percentage. The key here is they want to maintain that percent ownership. So by giving you this amount right here, which is 250K, 250K, and you're locking it in at a 2.5 maximum valuation, if you divide these two numbers, you actually see that what in essence what the investor is saying is, I'm giving you this so that you can give me 10% of your company, right? You've now agreed and locked in and said, I'm going to give you 10% of the company. So what that essentially means is that you now have to first recalculate the number of shares. And what that does is it raises the total number of 5 million shares actually up to 5.555 million, right? So the original number plus 5.55 million, which means that if you actually look at it, they own 10% of the company, right? You've given them exactly 10%. And then so once that actually gets locked in, now you actually can determine the number of total shares that the new investors will get. So this is where the calculation gets really complicated. I'll show you the simulator in a bit, but essentially what I do want to say is, by doing post money, you can notice that all investors benefit a little more, because even the new investors previously, when they gained $1 per share, they actually had a little bit of a buffer as well by benefiting from the previous investor, and they both pay slightly lower. And now you can see that instead of 80%, the founder and stock option pool is down to 70, and then 75, sorry, and then now they've actually gained an additional 5%. All right. So again, the calculations for this is a little bit tricky, but hopefully maybe I'll help a little bit in the calculator, or honestly just use the calculator. You can't go wrong. All right. But okay, and then so now let's talk about like what the discount is. Discount actually is a little bit more simpler than post value. If there's no cap involved, what you do is, again, you use that pre-money valuation set by new investors of $1 here, and then all you do is just provide a 20% discount on top of that, and that's what the angel investor gets. So if the new investors pay $1 per share, the angel investor by default pays 20% less. All right, so this is also a straightforward calculation as well. And then finally, in scenario 4, when you have both at work, what happens is essentially you just examine both cases, and then you pick the one that benefits the founder, or not the founder, sorry, the investor, the holder of the JKIS the most. And in this case, you can see that it was case number 2 with the post money value cap at 45 cents per share, and then this is the one that they're going to get. All right. So just a quick summary on the reason why these two exist. Valuation cap essentially just puts an upper limit on the conversion price, right? Later you get your company valued. The valuation cap just makes sure that the angel investor does not have to convert at that higher value. They can convert at a lower value because they arrived sooner. It protects them from dilution because it locks them in at a lower rate. But the only disadvantage is that if later on you actually convert at a much lower value than what they asked for, they don't benefit at all. Right? So it's very possible sometimes, just depending on how things go, your valuation is actually lower than the value cap put in. And if that's the case, I think it's like gambling, right? It is a little bit of like a expectation of what you want on both the founder's part and on the investor's part. And so they may or may not benefit from it, just depending on how your future valuation goes. The conversion discount doesn't really try to protect the dilution as much, but what they're trying to do is just make sure that the investor always gets a lower price. It's not capped, but it does give them a relatively lower price depending on what your valuation is at that later stage. Okay, so lots of information. And to the post money thing is the really confusing thing, so I'm just going to screen share right now and actually show you guys the give me 1 second to set up the screen share. How do I do this? I think this is it. Okay, great. You guys can see my screen. Can you guys see this Excel page? Yes? No? I actually cannot see if you guys are nodding.
No, we can't.
Oh, you
afraid.
cannot. Okay,
No.
let me try sharing a different way then. Let me stop sharing. Let me try sharing my entire screen. Maybe that will help. What about now? Is it working?
No, it's not working.
No, it's still not working.
God damn
Okay.
it, Nate.
Okay, all right. So it's fine. Then let me see if what I can do is this then. Okay. The screen share does seem to be working on my end, but at the very least, let me do this. Let me just screenshot what this looks like, And I'll just try and explain what some of these things are. And then, okay, you guys can see this though.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so this, I haven't showed the cap table because the screen's a little bit too big, but I'll just show one piece at a time. So right now, this is kind of like the money, the input, right? On the right here is the shareholders table. So first thing you can do is just set it up yourself. And I left a lot of empty space here because you can just type in, add in additional founders if you need, or edit it however you need, right? Make it reflect your company. Then over here, the keynote I have is right here. Only the numbers in blue should be edited. Please do not touch any of the black numbers because you will break formulas. All black numbers are formulas. So the investment maturity amount here is locked in at 1 million because again, this is the JKISS terms, right? The JKISS is usually 1 million, so I just put this in as a good reference. This second one is just a check to make sure if its maturity has been reached because it depends on how much you've raised. If I put it in a number less than 1 million, this actually turns into no, and the simulator doesn't proceed. And then here, you can put in the pre-money valuation at that new investor finance. So this is just simulating what we just talked about, pretending, let's say we have we're rated at 5 million. Here, I've added a valuation cap toggle between pre-money and post-money, especially since we're talking about post-money. I've set the example to be there, but you could also change it to pre-money just to see how it might change. And the general idea here is that for post-money, right here, for this angel investor number 1, you're essentially, for this amount, at this valuation cap, you're essentially telling them, I'm going to lock you in at 10%, and therefore, the valuation cap total shares has to be 5.555 million, because you started with 5 million, and you're guaranteed to give them this 555,000 to make sure that they maintain this 10%, right? And then once this calculation has been complete, you get a reference of how much price per share they're getting paid. And then at the very bottom, you start to see in the table, you start to see the calculation of exactly what happens to them. And so let me actually show you what the bottom looks like. Let me copy that out. So if I do this, right? So this is actually what the table looks like now. So as you can see, this angel investor 1 is exactly what we calculated based on the number of shares. And if you saw before, right, what we talked about, 10% of 5.55 is this 555,000, right? You've guaranteed them 10% before Series A financing gets calculated. The reason why they actually have less than 10% now is because once now you've issued the new 1.11 shares to the new investors, obviously the angel investor is going to get diluted, right? But the purpose of the post-money valuation is to make sure that before you calculate any new investors, before you even get there, the angel investor at least is guaranteed that 10%, right? That's what they like. And on top of that, if you've noticed, I've actually added a angel investor number 2. And if you actually put in a number here, you'll be able to see the calculations between the percentages here that these two angel investors actually do not dilute each other. That's the benefit of post-money. Post-money protects angel investors from each other. If this person gets 10%, they're going to get 10%. If this person gets 5%, they're going to get 5%. And then they only experience dilution once this actual new investor comes in, right? And so that's essentially kind of how this tracker works, and it just gives you a reference to be able to play with these numbers and say, okay, if I give this person this much and they agree to this much valuation cap, what might the ending look like, right? How might that affect me in the end? What might it look like to them? And then is this essentially acceptable, right? Is going down to 75% acceptable, right? And I think that's the purpose. The other side of this calculator, which I'll just quickly copy, and I won't talk too much about it, but I'll just reference it, is when we talked about the discount, right? This on the right side calculates the discount equivalent. So if you actually apply a 20% discount, let's say to this the very first angel investor, this is actually the number of shares they gain, and this is what the cap table would look like. And if you compare to the previous one, you can see that here, angel investor 1 actually got a lot more, right, compared to in under post cap valuation compared to the conversion discount, and therefore the other table takes precedence, and that's what they'll convert under. Right. Okay, questions on any of these pieces? Lots of information just thrown at you.
Yes, I have one.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's a lot I don't understand, but would you mind unlocking?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So there's just one thing that I found a bit confusing. So this angel investor here, right? He has like no discount, right? And he gets 4%.
Yes.
And then where was this with discount? This
He gets a
no,
higher
yes.
percent, right?
Okay.
He gets a higher percent.
Okay. I confused this. I thought, why does he get a lower percent? But okay.
No.
that
He
makes
actually gets a
sense.
higher one. Yeah. You know,
Right.
actually, this might be helpful. Let me do something. Can I give you guys the link to this, and then maybe I can make edits. If you guys could just open, open this link in your browser, and then I can just make edits directly there, so you can just see it, and then just let me know if you're unable to. Can you guys see like my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, if you can see my cursor, that's great. So I think what I want to show essentially is the difference, and because I think one of the key things, especially now that you have an option technically between post money and pre money, is understanding the difference. And I really wanted to talk about this, because if I change this from post money to pre money, right? First, if you remember, let's look down at the bottom table. Under the angel investor 1, currently under post money, they get 8.33%. If I change this to pre money, you can see they actually get a lot less.
Right.
Right, they get a lot less because this calculation, pre money, actually nullifies this row 20 right here. This row 20 post money is saying that I want to guarantee you this equity, but then by doing pre money, you're not guaranteeing it to them at all. Angel investor 2 actually can affect angel investor 1, and by consequentially these new investors also under the valuation cap table, they also affect angel investor 1 on a bigger scale as well. So the pre-money is just more beneficial for founders in general, but it's a lot harder for investors to understand, which is why post-money was introduced to help investors understand exactly what percent they're going to get, and that's what they're going to get before they get diluted.
Right.
Yeah.
Amazing calculator.
Thank you. I don't think it's perfect, right? I just want to put it the caveat. I really don't think it's perfect because if you actually also think about it, this does not take into account the timing. Your angel investor 2 might come in at a much later date than angel investor 1. They might not both convert at the same time. This calculator right now, the way it's set up is if you do introduce a second investor, let's say the second investor contributes 100K at a valuation cap of maybe like 1.5 million, right? The calculation is based on both of them converting at the same time. All right, so in actuality, depending on how your timing goes, it's definitely going to be a little bit more complicated and different. But at the very least, my purpose is to create something that you can visualize, right? Even if it's not perfect, you at least can kind of see how the numbers shift. And one of the big things here is that if you pick up on this as well, if you look on the conversion discount side, 20% conversion discount is usually standard, and even then, it's very, very, very inferior to the post-money value cap. Right? You can see that there's a huge difference. Under post-money valuation cap, the investors actually get almost more, like 2 times or more than 2 times of what they would get under the conversion discount. But regardless, the conversion discount is there just in case the valuation on the post-money value cap doesn't work out, and they might benefit from it. Right? The conversion discount, I would imagine, comes in play when the valuation cap is actually set too high, and your actual valuation is not that high, and therefore the price per share based on that would actually benefit them much more than the post valuation cap.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. So I think this is it, and you can feel free, right, again, to type in, because like if I write here, if you see me, I just typed in founder 2. Both of the tables on the bottom auto update. Founder 2 is now added to the table as well. And so as long as you don't delete any columns and you don't mess with any of these blanks, all you do is just type in what you need to type in. They will automatically resort and recalculate to take into account however many stockholders you have.
Right, understood. But you have that backed up, right?
No, so this is I think this is view only for you. So in order to
Okay.
in order to use it, you'll have to make a copy of it. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So I think that is it. So beyond that, right? I think to be honest, all of this took me a couple hours to learn, and on top of that, every time I look at it, I have to relearn it. It's like you're gonna have to keep looking at it and play with the calculator multiple times before you really get comfortable with what these numbers mean and how things are calculated. And so it's not easy, right? I think my goal is just to try and facilitate it, but it will take some time. And what I'm trying to get at is, if you feel like you don't get it, don't worry, you will eventually. Once you start actually doing it more, you will.
Yeah, thanks, Roger.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that is it then from me. So questions, concerns, thoughts? If not, I think we can end the session. Yeah. So do you have anything to add, Miho, for the recording, for anything?
Yeah, I think it's perfect. Yeah, hope
Okay.
it was helpful for both of you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So for all of you guys, we'll be back on Friday for the next section, and on Friday we'll be talking specifically about income statements and financial statements, what the numbers mean, how to use it to your advantage in a narrative, and then essentially start to look at some templates and how to fill out these templates, these forms and financial statements in a way that can really tell a story about your company, and tell a good one at that. Right. So that's what we're going to be doing on Friday.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thanks, Roger.
Awesome.
Thanks, Miho.
Thank you guys so much for your time, and we'll see you guys again soon. Yep. Bye
Yeah,
bye.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.